The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood 22-year-old Marcus Wellington, his designer sunglasses, reflecting the ornate gates of the palace. Marcus wasn't just any tourist. He was the son of respected Member of Parliament Richard Wellington, a man who had spent decades building his reputation in British politics. Marcus had grown up in privilege, attending the finest schools and moving in circles where rules seemed more like suggestions. His father's position had always opened doors, smoothed over mistakes, and provided him with a sense of untouchability that had only grown stronger with age. That morning, he had convinced 3 of his university friends to join him for what he called a bit of fun in the city. The group had started their day at an expensive restaurant in Mayfair, where Marcus had entertained his friends with stories about his father's political connections and the family's upcoming invitation to a parliamentary reception. He spoke loudly, ensuring nearby diners could hear about his privileged background. His friends, accustomed to Marcus's boastful nature, simply nodded along while enjoying their expensive meal. As they made their way toward Buckingham Palace, Marcus began plotting what he considered would be the highlight of their day. He had heard stories about the Queen's Guard, how they were trained to remain perfectly still regardless of what happened around them. To Marcus, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to create some entertainment and show off in front of his friends. The Queen's Guard stood at their posts with unwavering discipline. These weren't mere ceremonial figures, as many tourists believed, but highly trained soldiers from elite regiments of the British Army. Each guard had undergone rigorous training and had likely served in combat zones around the world. They were armed, alert, and took their duty to protect the royal family with absolute seriousness. Guard James Morrison had been standing at his post for 45 minutes when he noticed the young man in expensive clothes beginning to circle closer. Morrison was a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan and had been selected for Queen's Guard duty based on his exemplary service record. He had seen countless tourists try to get reactions from the guards over the years, but something about this particular young man's demeanor suggested more than typical tourist curiosity. Marcus approached the guard with confidence, his friends trailing behind with their phones ready to record what they expected would be a hilarious encounter. The crowd around them began to take notice as Marcus positioned himself directly in front of Guard Morrison. Some tourists sensed something was about to happen and started pulling out their own cameras. The atmosphere grew tense as Marcus began his performance. He started with exaggerated facial expressions, trying to mirror the guard's serious stance in a mocking way. When this failed to get any reaction, he became more animated, waving his arms and making ridiculous poses just inches from the guard's face. The crowd watched with a mixture of amusement and discomfort. Marcus's friends encouraged him with laughter and comments, completely unaware of the serious nature of what they were witnessing. They saw only an amusing prank, not understanding that they were watching someone cross lines that should never be crossed. The other tourists began to murmur among themselves, some expressing disapproval at the young man's behavior. Guard Morrison remained perfectly still, his training taking over as he maintained his position despite the growing provocation. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, but his peripheral vision tracked every movement the young man made. Inside, Morrison was calculating distances, assessing potential threats, and preparing for whatever might come next. The situation was escalating, and he could feel the tension building in the crowd around them. Emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, Marcus decided to escalate his performance. He began making loud comments about the guard's appearance, criticizing his uniform and questioning whether he was even a real soldier. His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing more attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. Some tourists started taking videos, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Marcus had always been the type to push boundaries when he felt he had an audience. His privileged upbringing had taught him that consequences were things that happened to other people, not to the son of a powerful politician. He stepped even closer to Guard Morrison, now close enough that his breath could be felt on the soldier's face. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that he was aware of the increasingly aggressive behavior. The crowd around them had grown considerably. What started as casual tourist observation had transformed into a tense spectacle. Some visitors began expressing their disapproval openly, whispering among themselves about the young man's inappropriate behavior. A few elderly tourists, clearly British locals, shook their heads in disgust and began moving away from the scene. Marcus's friends continued to encourage him, completely misreading the situation. They shouted suggestions for more outrageous behaviors, treating the entire encounter as nothing more than entertainment. Their privileged backgrounds had similarly shielded them from understanding the serious nature of what was unfolding. They had no concept of military discipline, royal protocol, or the genuine security concerns their friend was creating. Guard Morrison's training was being put to the ultimate test. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond to the provocation, but years of discipline held him in place. He had been taught that the uniform he wore represented not just himself, but the entire British military and the crown itself. His stillness wasn't weakness, it was strength of the highest order. But Marcus misinterpreted the guard's restraint as an invitation to go further. He began making personal insults about the guard's intelligence, suggesting that only stupid people would stand motionless for hours. His comments grew nastier, more pointed, designed to cut deep and provoke a reaction. The crowd's discomfort was becoming palpable, with many people now openly criticizing Marcus's behavior. Unknown to Marcus, several things were happening simultaneously around him. Palace security personnel had been alerted and were moving into position. Plainclothes officers were already in the crowd, having identified the disturbance and begun coordinating a response. Additionally, senior military personnel inside the palace had been notified of the escalating situation. Marcus made his fatal error when he decided that words weren't enough. Frustrated by the guard's continued stillness, he reached out and actually touched Guard Morrison's rifle. The moment his fingers made contact with the weapon, everything changed. The crowd gasped collectively as they realized the young man had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Guard Morrison's reaction was instantaneous and precisely calibrated. Years of training kicked in as he responded to what was now a genuine security threat. His movement was swift, controlled, and absolutely professional. The transformation from statue-like stillness to dynamic action happened so quickly that most observers barely registered what had occurred. The sound of Marcus hitting the ground echoed across the courtyard as he found himself face down on the cobblestones, the guard's boot pressing firmly against his back. His designer sunglasses skittered across the stones, cracked and broken. The sudden reversal of fortune was so complete and so swift that his friends stood frozen in shock, their phones still recording what had just become a very different kind of video. Marcus tried to speak, to protest, to invoke his father's name, but the weight of the guard's boot and his position made coherent speech impossible. For the first time in his life, his privileged background meant absolutely nothing. He was face down on ancient stones, held in place by a soldier who had just demonstrated exactly why the Queen's Guard commanded respect around the world. The crowd erupted into chaos as palace security officers appeared seemingly from nowhere, surrounding the scene with military precision. Their response was swift and coordinated, demonstrating that they had been monitoring the situation from the moment Marcus first approached the guard. These weren't ordinary security guards, but highly trained protection specialists who took any threat to royal security with absolute seriousness. Marcus lay pinned to the ground, his expensive clothing now dusty and disheveled from the cobblestones. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he felt the cold metal of handcuffs clicking around his wrists. His attempts to explain who his father was fell on deaf ears. The security personnel were focused entirely on neutralizing what they had identified as a security breach. His three friends stood in stunned silence, their phones now feeling heavy in their hands as they realized they had just recorded their friend committing what could be classified as a serious crime. The jovial atmosphere of their day out had evaporated completely, replaced by the stark reality of armed police officers and the serious faces of security personnel who clearly meant business. Guard Morrison returned to his position with the same professional composure he had maintained throughout the entire encounter. To the casual observer, it was as if nothing had happened, except for the young man now being processed by security officers just a few feet away. This return to normalcy was perhaps the most impressive display of all, showing the true discipline that defined the Queen's Guard. The lead security officer, Inspector David Collins, began the formal arrest procedure. Collins was a 20-year veteran who had handled everything from terrorist threats to diplomatic incidents. He had no patience for privileged young men who thought royal security was a game. As he read Marcus his rights, he could see the fear, beginning to replace the arrogance in the young man's eyes. Marcus's friends found themselves being questioned by additional officers who had materialized from the crowd. Their association with Marcus had now made them persons of interest, and their earlier encouragement of his behavior was being scrutinized. The videos on their phones, which they had intended as entertainment, were now potential evidence in a criminal case. The crowd of tourists watched in fascination as the drama unfolded. Many had their phones out, creating a permanent record of Marcus's humiliation that would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. What had started as a private joke among friends was now becoming a very public spectacle that would follow Marcus for years to come. Inspector Collins informed Marcus that he was being arrested on multiple charges, including breach of the peace, assault on a member of the armed forces, and interference with royal security. Each charge carried serious penalties, and the combination could result in significant jail time. The inspector's matter-of-fact delivery of this information seemed to finally penetrate Marcus's shock. As they prepared to transport him to the nearest police station, Marcus finally managed to stammer out his father's name and position. He expected this revelation to change everything, to make the officers reconsider their actions. Instead, Inspector Collins simply nodded and made a note in his report. The young man's political connections would be duly recorded, but they would not influence the legal proceedings. The irony wasn't lost on the experienced officer that the son of a lawmaker had just broken several laws in one of the most secure locations in Britain. If anything, Marcus's political connections made the incident more serious, not less. A member of Parliament's son attacking royal security would generate significant media attention and political embarrassment. Marcus was loaded into the back of an unmarked police vehicle, his hands still cuffed behind his back. Through the window, he could see tourists still pointing and taking pictures. His friends were being escorted to a separate vehicle for questioning, their faces pale with the realization that their day of fun had turned into a legal nightmare that would affect all of their futures. The news of Marcus Wellington's arrest reached his father's parliamentary office within hours, delivered by a grim-faced aide who had been monitoring police communications. Richard Wellington was in the middle of reviewing legislation when the call came in, and the color drained from his face as he listened to the details of his son's behavior outside Buckingham Palace. Richard had spent 30 years building his political reputation through careful diplomacy and respectful service. He had risen through the ranks by being the kind of politician who stayed out of scandals and focused on the needs of his constituents. Now, in a single afternoon, his son had potentially destroyed decades of careful reputation management. The senior politician immediately canceled his afternoon appointments and contacted the family's lawyer, Harold Pemberton, a distinguished barrister who had handled sensitive cases for the Wellington family for over 2 decades. Pemberton's initial assessment was blunt. Marcus was facing serious charges that could result in jail time, and his political connections might actually make the situation worse by attracting more media attention. Meanwhile, at the police station, Marcus sat in a holding cell experiencing the first real consequences of his privileged life. The cell was small, cold, and absolutely nothing like the comfortable environments he was accustomed to. His expensive clothes felt ridiculous in the harsh institutional setting, and his usual confidence had been replaced by a growing sense of panic. The duty solicitor assigned to his case was Sarah Mitchell, a no-nonsense lawyer who had seen countless young men from privileged backgrounds make similar mistakes. She listened to Marcus's version of events with professional detachment, occasionally shaking her head at his continued insistence that the incident had been just a bit of fun that had gotten out of hand. Mitchell explained to Marcus that touching a guard's weapon constituted assault on a member of the armed forces, a serious criminal offense that courts took very seriously. Additionally, his behavior had occurred at one of the most sensitive security locations in the country, which would influence how prosecutors approached the case. The young man's shock at learning the potential penalties was genuine. He had never considered that his actions might have real legal consequences. Back at Westminster, Richard Wellington was dealing with his own crisis. Word of his son's arrest had begun to spread among his parliamentary colleagues, and several had already approached him with expressions of concern and barely concealed curiosity. The political implications were becoming clear. His son's behavior would reflect on him and could potentially damage his effectiveness as a legislator. The first media reports began appearing on social media platforms within hours of the arrest. Videos taken by tourists showed Marcus's aggressive behavior toward the guard, followed by his swift takedown and arrest. The footage was damning, showing clearly that this wasn't a case of misunderstood youthful exuberance but deliberate provocation and assault. Political journalists, always alert for stories involving MPs and their families, began making calls to Westminster and police contacts. Richard Wellington's office was soon fielding requests for comments, each call making it clear that the story was gaining momentum and would likely dominate the news cycle for days. Inspector Collins completed his report with meticulous attention to detail, knowing that the case would receive significant scrutiny given the defendant's political connections. The report documented not only Marcus's actions, but also the security implications of the incident and the professional response of Guard Morrison, who had acted with exemplary restraint and precision. The Crown Prosecution Service received the case file that evening, and senior prosecutors immediately recognized the high-profile nature of the charges. The combination of the defendant's political background, the serious nature of the charges, and the clear video evidence made this a case that would require careful handling and would likely result in significant media attention. Marcus spent his first night in custody in a police cell, the reality of his situation finally beginning to sink in. His requests to call his father had been denied until the morning, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the growing realization that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own future. The privileged bubble that had protected him throughout his life had finally burst, and he was facing the real world for the first time. The next morning brought a media storm that exceeded even Richard Wellington's worst fears. The story had exploded across national newspapers, television news programs, and social media platforms. The headline, "MP's Son Attacks Queen's Guard," dominated the front pages, accompanied by clear photographs of Marcus being arrested and still images from the tourist videos showing his aggressive behavior. The video footage had gone viral overnight, shared thousands of times across various platforms with commentary ranging from outrage at Marcus's behavior to praise for the guard's professional response. British viewers were particularly incensed by what they saw as disrespect toward both the military and the Crown, two institutions that commanded deep respect across the political spectrum. Richard Wellington arrived at his parliamentary office to find a crowd of journalists waiting outside, cameras and microphones ready to capture his reaction to his son's behavior. His usual route through the building had been blocked by media personnel, forcing him to enter through a back entrance normally used by staff members. The humiliation was complete and very public. His political colleagues' reactions were mixed, but universally concerned about the implications for Richard's career. Some offered private support while others quietly began distancing themselves from what they saw as a liability. The Conservative Party leadership called an emergency meeting to discuss how to handle the political fallout from one of their MP's family members attacking royal security. Meanwhile, Marcus appeared before Westminster Magistrates' Court for his initial hearing. The courthouse was surrounded by journalists and photographers, creating a circus atmosphere that emphasized the public nature of his disgrace. His expensive legal team, led by Harold Pemberton, had prepared carefully for the hearing, but the evidence against their client was overwhelming. The prosecution outlined the charges methodically: assault on a member of the armed forces, breach of the peace, and interference with royal security operations. They played the tourist videos in court, showing Marcus's escalating aggression and his deliberate touching of Guard Morrison's rifle. The magistrate watched with obvious disapproval as the footage revealed the full extent of the defendant's behavior. Pemberton argued for bail, emphasizing Marcus's lack of previous criminal convictions and his family's standing in the community. However, the prosecution countered by highlighting the serious nature of the security breach and the potential for the defendant to use his political connections to interfere with witnesses or the investigation. The magistrate granted bail but imposed strict conditions. Marcus was forbidden from approaching within 500 meters of any royal residence, required to surrender his passport, and mandated to report to police twice weekly. The conditions were humiliating for someone accustomed to freedom and privilege, but they were necessary to ensure he appeared for trial. Outside the courthouse, Pemberton faced a barrage of questions from journalists, while Marcus was hustled into a waiting car through a crowd of photographers. The lawyer's carefully prepared statement emphasizing his client's remorse and respect for British institutions felt hollow, given the clear evidence of Marcus's behavior captured on video. The political consequences for Richard Wellington were swift and severe. By afternoon, he had received a call from the chief whip requesting his presence at a party disciplinary meeting. Several constituent organizations had already contacted his office expressing their disappointment and questioning whether he should remain as their representative. The Prime Minister's office issued a brief statement distancing the government from Marcus's actions, while expressing confidence in the judicial system to handle the matter appropriately. However, political insiders understood that Richard Wellington's effectiveness as an MP had been severely compromised, and his chances of advancement within the party had essentially evaporated. Guard Morrison, meanwhile, continued his duties with the same professionalism he had demonstrated during the incident. His commanding officer had commended him for his restraint and precision in handling a difficult situation. The military hierarchy was pleased that their training and protocols had been vindicated by the Guard's textbook response to provocation. The incident had broader implications for royal security protocols, prompting a review of crowd control measures and tourist management around royal residences. While the existing procedures had worked effectively, security chiefs wanted to ensure that future incidents could be prevented before they escalated to the point of physical confrontation. Marcus returned to his family's London townhouse to face his father's disappointment and anger. The conversation between father and son was brief and cold, with Richard making it clear that Marcus's actions had not only ruined his own future, but had potentially destroyed his father's political career as well. The privileged young man was finally confronting the full consequences of his thoughtless behavior. 3 months later, Marcus Wellington stood in the dock at Southwark Crown Court facing the consequences of his moment of arrogance outside Buckingham Palace. The intervening months had been a nightmare of legal preparation, media scrutiny, and social isolation as friends and acquaintances distanced themselves from the scandal that had consumed his family. The trial had attracted significant public attention, with the courtroom packed with journalists and members of the public who wanted to witness justice being served. The prosecution had built an overwhelming case, supported by multiple video recordings from different angles and testimony from numerous witnesses who had observed Marcus's escalating aggression toward Guard Morrison. Guard Morrison himself testified, with the same composed professionalism he had displayed during the incident. His account of events was precise and factual, describing how he had maintained his position despite increasing provocation until the defendant's physical contact with his weapon had required immediate action. His testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Marcus had committed a serious assault on a serving member of the armed forces. The defense team had struggled to find an effective strategy given the clear video evidence of their client's behavior. Pemberton had eventually settled on arguing for leniency based on Marcus's youth, his lack of previous convictions, and what he described as a moment of poor judgment rather than malicious intent. However, the prosecution's evidence made it clear that Marcus's actions had been deliberate and sustained over several minutes. Marcus himself had been required to testify, an experience that proved humiliating as the prosecution methodically exposed his privileged background and sense of entitlement. His attempts to portray the incident as harmless fun were undermined by the video evidence, showing his aggressive behavior and complete disrespect for both the Guard and the institution he represented. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. He described Marcus's behavior as a disgraceful attack on a serving soldier who had been carrying out his duties with exemplary professionalism. He noted that the defendant's privileged background made his actions more reprehensible, not less, as he should have understood the importance of respecting British institutions and the military. Marcus was sentenced to 6 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay substantial fines and court costs. Additionally, he was banned from approaching any royal residence for 5 years and required to issue a public apology to Guard Morrison and the regiment he served with. The sentence was widely viewed as appropriate, given the serious nature of the charges, though some critics argued that Marcus's political connections had helped him avoid a harsher punishment. The suspended sentence meant he would avoid immediate imprisonment, but would face jail time if he committed any further offenses within the 2-year period. Richard Wellington's political career never recovered from his son's actions. Despite his decades of public service, the constant media attention and constituent pressure eventually forced him to announce that he would not stand for re-election. His final speech to Parliament was a dignified farewell that acknowledged how his son's behavior had overshadowed his own contributions to public life. Marcus completed his community service working with military veterans, an assignment that proved to be genuinely educational as he encountered soldiers who had served with distinction and sacrifice. For the first time in his privileged life, he was exposed to people who had earned respect through service rather than inheritance, and the experience began a slow process of personal growth. The incident became a case study in royal security training programs, used to demonstrate both proper restraint and appropriate response when civilians cross clearly established boundaries. Guard Morrison was commended for his handling of the situation and eventually promoted, his career enhanced rather than damaged by his involvement in the high-profile incident. Years later, Marcus would reflect on that summer day as the moment his comfortable, privileged world collapsed and forced him to confront reality for the first time. The consequences of his actions had extended far beyond himself, destroying his father's political career and teaching him that respect must be earned rather than assumed. The Queen's Guard had indeed taught him a lesson, though not the one he had intended to give.